Analysis of claims in Dr. Tara Swart's podcast interview. Communication with the dead. Is it supported by science? Dr. Tara Swart claims she has found 100% certainty that it is possible to communicate with someone who has died. She bases this on personal experiences, seeing apparitions of her late husband and signs like feathers or robins, and on phenomena like near-death experiences, NDEs, and terminal lucidity. However, current scientific consensus does not support the idea that the deceased can literally communicate with the living. Extensive research in psychology and parapsychology over more than a century has failed to provide reliable, reproducible evidence that consciousness survives death, or that mediums can obtain information from the dead under controlled conditions. Scientists who study paranormal claims generally conclude that alleged spirit communications result from fraud, suggestion, or psychological factors rather than actual contact with spirits. For example, many messages from mediums can be explained by cold reading or the bereaved person's own expectations and perceptions. Importantly, experiencing a sense of a dead loved one's presence is common in grief, but researchers consider these experiences a natural part of bereavement rather than proof of literal communication. Classic surveys found that nearly half of widowed people reported sensing or even briefly seeing their deceased spouse. More recent studies likewise show 30 to 60% of bereaved individuals have phenomena like hearing a voice, feeling a touch, seeing a loved one, or simply feeling their presence. Psychologists call these post-bereavement hallucinations, or sensed presences, and they are usually benign and comforting. Crucially, experiencing such a visitation does not prove the person's spirit is truly present. It can be explained by the brain's coping mechanisms. Grief can create powerful expectations and internal representations. For instance, a grieving person might momentarily interpret a shadow or a familiar-looking stranger as the deceased, a misperception, or hear the loved one's voice in their head providing comfort. Far from being a sign of insanity, as Dr. Swart worried, these experiences are considered normal in grief and not indicative of actual external communication. Dr. Swart cites dramatic NDE anecdotes. For example, a patient who saw a deceased nurse during a cardiac arrest and learned information he couldn't have known otherwise. While such stories are compelling, they remain anecdotal. No matter how convincing a single case seems, it is not robust scientific evidence. Memory and perception under extreme conditions, like trauma or low oxygen, can be unreliable. In the nurse story, we have only second-hand recounting. There's no way to rigorously verify the patient's report. Confirmation bias is at play. Believers highlight cases that fit the pattern, ignoring those that don't, and may unconsciously embellish details to make them more miraculous. Additionally, appeal to authority is used. Dr. Swart notes the NDE accounts came from medical doctors, suggesting we should trust them more. But an MD sharing a personal supernatural experience is still a personal anecdote, not a scientific study. Many scientists, including neurologists and psychologists, attribute NDE phenomena to physiological and neurological processes in a dying or reviving brain, for example, oxygen deprivation, neurotransmitter surges, rather than proof of the soul leaving the body. Dr. Swart's scientific credibility in neuroscience does not extend to proving afterlife communication. Her background is in medicine and neuroscience, not parapsychology, and she approached this topic after a traumatic loss. In the podcast, she openly admits she went looking for science to back it up after her experiences, indicating a strong confirmation bias. Rather than testing a neutral hypothesis, she was motivated to validate a comforting belief which can skew one's interpretation of research. While she describes doing a literature review on consciousness outside the body, she predominantly presents fringe or unexplained cases as if they conclusively support her hypothesis. This overstates the evidence. The vast majority of neuroscientists and psychiatrists would say there is no accepted scientific evidence that minds survive bodily death in a way that allows communication. Such claims conflict with everything we know about the brain generating the mind. Indeed, anomalistic psychology research concludes mediumistic experiences can be explained without invoking actual spirits. Dr. Swart's 100% certainty is itself a red flag. Science rarely deals in absolutes, especially about such extraordinary claims. Her absolute conviction suggests personal belief trumping scientific caution. In summary, Dr. Swart's claim that we can literally communicate with the dead is not supported by peer-reviewed scientific evidence. There is no robust evidence of actual after-death communication, only personal experiences and anecdotes. The phenomena she cites, sensed presences, NDEs, terminal lucidity, are intriguing and worthy of study. But mainstream science offers natural explanations, or at least does not require spirits as explanations for each. By using her credentials and personal story to bolster these claims, Dr. Swart risks misrepresenting spiritual or subjective experiences as scientific proof. The 34 human senses, exaggeration or fact? In the interview, Dr. Swart asserts that humans have 34 senses, as we currently understand it, instead of the traditional 5. This claim is surprising, but actually has a basis in scientific literature, depending on how one defines a sense. Neuroscientists and philosophers have long acknowledged that we have more than 5 senses. In fact, many experts argue humans have between about 22 and 33 senses. Besides the classic 5, sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch, we have proprioception, sense of body position, vestibular sense, balance and acceleration, interoceptive senses, hunger, thirst, internal pain, need to urinate, etc., thermoception, temperature, nociception, pain, and more. Some sources do count these out to a total in the low 30s. For example, chronobiologists consider our sense of time, chronoception, and some lists even subdivide senses, for instance, distinguishing color vision from light-dark perception, to reach numbers in the 30s. Thus, the statement that humans have on the order of 30-plus senses is not pseudoscience. It reflects a broader definition of sensory modalities used in modern neuroscience. However, what Dr. Swart does with this fact is an issue of framing and implication. She uses 34 senses as a rhetorical device to argue that the human mind has far greater capacities than we realize, implying that if we have dozens of senses we routinely ignore, we might tap into extrasensory abilities. There is a sleight of hand in definition here. Nearly all of those 34 senses are well understood physiological senses, e.g., equilibrium, proprioception, visceral sensations, none of which is a mystical sixth sense. They are not extrasensory in the paranormal sense. They are normal sensory or bodily awareness channels. For instance, knowing where your limbs are with your eyes closed is proprioception, mediated by stretch receptors in muscles. This doesn't mean you have a psychic ability, just a less obvious sense. Dr. Swart does acknowledge that people commonly talk of a potential sixth sense, like seeing ghosts, but she doesn't claim all 34 include such abilities. Still, she uses the existence of many senses to challenge the audience's assumptions and open the door to the idea that we are capable of much more than we think. This is a rhetorical leap. It's true we have more than 5 senses, but that fact alone does not imply we can communicate with spirits or access hidden dimensions of reality. It's a non sequitur to go from "we have dozens of physiological senses" to "therefore, unseen intuitive or psychic abilities are real." the expanded list of senses still operates within the material body and brain. So, is the claim exaggerated or misrepresented? Saying 34 senses without context can be misleading to a lay audience who might think entirely new magical senses have been discovered. In reality, scientists simply classify senses differently. There is no universally agreed number. It depends whether you split or lump sensory modalities. One could group some or count subsenses separately. For example, vision could be broken into separate senses for color, depth, shape, motion, etc., or just called one sense. Some authors count every distinct type of receptor: photoreceptors, mechanoreceptors, chemoreceptors for taste, smell, etc., which yields a high count. The psychology stack exchange discussion Dr. Swart drew from, via a literature review or possibly an AI source, pointed out that there's no point to counting senses rigidly. It's somewhat arbitrary how we define a sense. So, Dr. Swart's number 34 is likely an arbitrary high-end estimate, not a settled scientific fact. That said, the core idea, we have many senses beyond the famous 5, is absolutely correct and supported by scientific consensus. The flaw is in how this fact is leveraged. Dr. Swart presents it as if it were shocking secret knowledge. The things I found out are going to shock you, and uses it to build momentum for her more controversial points. This is a strategy of mixing mundane truth with speculative assertion. By impressing the listener with 34 senses, a real but context-dependent point, she gains credibility to then suggest some of those senses could help us perceive signs or spirits. No scientific evidence links our additional senses, like proprioception or balance, to any paranormal perception. But after hearing a neuroscientist confirm we have more senses, a listener might be more open to the idea of a sixth sense or other unseen capabilities. This subtle equivocation, equating established sensory science with the unknown, the unseen, is a way of lending scientific weight to non-scientific notions. In summary, humans do have far more than 5 senses, and Dr. Swart is correct on that point. The exaggeration lies in implying that this unlocks some untapped potential for extraordinary abilities. The additional senses we know of are still firmly physical, e.g. sensing gravity or internal body states, and recognizing them doesn't validate communication with the dead or similar claims. Terminal lucidity and near-death phenomena. Interpreting the unexplained. Terminal lucidity refers to an unexpected return of mental clarity shortly before death, often in patients with severe dementia or brain damage. Dr. Swart discusses cases where an Alzheimer's patient who hadn't spoken in years suddenly becomes lucid, recognizes family, and then dies a few hours later. She rightly notes that this phenomenon is real and currently unexplained by standard medicine. It has been documented anecdotally by nurses, doctors, and families. The scientific question is, what causes terminal lucidity? Dr. Swart's interpretation is that it suggests the mind can operate independently of the failing brain, supporting her hypothesis that consciousness isn't entirely produced by the brain, and therefore could persist after death. Essentially, she argues, if a severely damaged brain can briefly manifest normal consciousness at death, maybe the mind is not bound to the brain's normal functioning, hinting at a soul or non-material aspect. It's true that terminal lucidity defies our current neurological understanding. But Dr. Swart's conclusion is not the only possible interpretation. In fact, ongoing research is exploring physiological explanations. Neuroscientists have found evidence that the dying brain can undergo a surge of organized activity as oxygen and nutrients drop. For example, studies monitoring EEG brainwaves in comatose patients as they passed away detected a spike in high-frequency gamma oscillations in the moments around and after the last heartbeat. Gamma waves are associated with conscious brain states. One hypothesis is that as the brain suffers global oxygen loss, disinhibition or neurotransmitter dumps might trigger a final coherent firing of neurons, which could briefly restore cognitive functions or trigger vivid experiences. The Cleveland Clinic notes that one theory is oxygen deprivation causes a surge in brain activity that could temporarily improve cognition, essentially the brain's last gasp, not a miracle. Recent scientific perspectives even propose that in end-stage dementia, hypoxia, low oxygen, might induce neural bypasses or reactivation of silent synapses, briefly allowing the brain to work around damaged areas. In other words, as death nears, the biochemical chaos might lift or reroute some neural blocks, allowing a short resurgence of lucidity, even without healing the underlying damage. This is still speculative, but it shows that materialist explanations are being considered. Crucially, these explanations do not require invoking an immaterial mind. They work within the brain organ framework, e.g. the brain's remaining circuits firing in an unusual, transient way. Dr. Swart, however, tells the audience there is no explanation. The only explanation is that the mind is not emergent from matter. This is a logical fallacy known as argument from ignorance. She assumes that because current science can't fully explain terminal lucidity, it must be proof of her dualist hypothesis. In reality, unexplained does not automatically mean, therefore, supernatural. It simply means we don't yet know. Her statement that 100% I'm sure and that terminal lucidity cannot be neurochemical is an overreach and misrepresentation of the scientific situation. It ignores early research hints to the contrary, e.g. gamma wave surges, which she even briefly acknowledges as possibly a surge in neurochemicals, but then dismisses. Moreover, terminal lucidity, while remarkable, is rare, and it often occurs very close to death. This makes it extremely hard to study under controlled conditions. We mostly have case reports. Dr. Swart frames it as a profound mystery pointing to the soul, but a skeptic could equally argue, if anything, terminal lucidity might be the brain's final flare of activity before shutting down, akin to a candle flame burning brightest just as it runs out of wax. We can't yet confirm either story, but it is premature to declare the soul hypothesis correct by default. Dr. Swart's stance also involves a bit of confirmation bias. She was actively looking for evidence that mind and brain separate to validate her afterlife communication idea, and latched onto terminal lucidity. She cherry-picks the mystery but doesn't mention, for instance, that many dying patients do not get lucid. Many simply remain confused or unresponsive until death. If the soul were being freed consistently, one might expect clear-minded farewells to be common. They are not universal, only occasional. One palliative study noted, most hospice workers witness only a few dozen lucid episodes in their whole career. So the phenomenon, while real, could be a fluke of biology at the brink, not a rule of metaphysics. Dr. Swart also discusses near-death experiences in general, e.g. people seeing tunnels of light, or accurate details from outside their body, etc. She finds the fact that thousands of NDE accounts have similarities compelling, especially since some experiencers, like Dr. Evan Alexander, were once skeptics. The scientific community acknowledges NDEs as meaningful human experiences, but remains divided on their interpretation. Many neuroscientists point to common patterns of a brain under extreme stress. Tunneled vision could come from decreased blood flow to the eyes, euphoria could come from endorphin release, life review and bright lights could be related to temporal lobe stimulation or the above-mentioned gamma wave surge just before brain activity ceases. Notably, cardiac arrest survivors' brains don't fully die immediately. Recent studies show there is a window of activity after the heart stops. So what the person reports upon resuscitation might correspond to real but internal brain events during that window. Dr. Swart leans on the veridical NDE anecdotes, like the man who learned of the nurse's death, to imply something beyond brain function occurred. These cases are the most intriguing, but so far none has been documented under conditions that rule out all normal explanation, e.g., perhaps the patient heard staff talking about the nurse's accident, unbeknownst to them. Some hospitals have even placed hidden signs or images high in emergency rooms to test if NDE out-of-body perceptions can actually see them. To date, no NDE patient has reliably reported those hidden targets, suggesting their vision wasn't truly from outside their body. Dr. Swart does not mention these negative or null findings, focusing only on the sensational positive stories. This is another example of cherry-picking evidence to fit the narrative. In evaluating Dr. Swart's credibility here, she is a trained neuroscientist, yet her interpretation of terminal lucidity and NDEs aligns more with a spiritual/paranormal outlook than a neuroscientific consensus. It's somewhat unusual for a neuroscientist to outright endorse mind-body dualism based on anecdotal evidence. That doesn't automatically invalidate her, but it does put her at odds with mainstream neuroscience, which overwhelmingly operates under the model that mind arises from brain activity. Listeners should be aware that Dr. Swart's position is a minority and controversial one among scientists. By invoking her authority, as a doctor, hearing these stories from other doctors was really convincing. She uses an appeal to authority and personal credulity rather than hard evidence. Her approach sometimes borders on argument by personal incredulity. We can't explain this, so it must be something miraculous. This is not rigorous reasoning. A true scientific mindset keeps such mysteries as open questions and actively looks for any possible explanation rather than concluding one of the most extraordinary claims, existence of an independent soul, is proven by default. In summary, terminal lucidity is a genuine, fascinating phenomenon, but its cause remains unknown. Dr. Swart treats unknown as proof of the supernatural, which is a leap not justified by evidence. Alternate scientific hypotheses involving end-of-life brain dynamics are on the table, and until we have more data, it's speculative for anyone, including Dr. Swart, to claim 100% certainty about what it means. The same caution applies to NDEs. They do not constitute evidence that consciousness literally detached from the body. They are subjective experiences that can often be framed within neurophysiology. Dr. Swart's treatment of these topics shows scientific gaps being filled with assumptions and a strong dose of confirmation bias, given her personal desire to validate life after death. Dark retreats. Altered states or spiritual reality. The podcast also covers dark retreats, prolonged voluntary isolation in pitch darkness, which Dr. Swart describes as a method to induce experiences similar to near-death experiences. She explains that dark retreats, rooted in Tibetan and other ancient traditions, involve spending days or weeks in complete darkness and silence, which eventually leads to vivid hallucinations of lights, visions of beings, and profound psychological effects. Dr. Swart notes that after a few days in darkness, people start seeing light patterns and even apparitions, often described as deities or mythical figures, in the absence of any external sensory input. Upon emerging, participants report positive outcomes like a renewed joy for life, less fear of death, and greater compassion. From a scientific standpoint, none of this is particularly surprising. Sensory deprivation is well known to cause the brain to generate its own perceptions. Deprived of normal visual stimuli, the visual cortex can become hyperexcitable, leading to phosphenes, perceived lights, and complex hallucinations. This is akin to the prisoner's cinema, a phenomenon where people in the dark see light shapes. Dr. Swart acknowledges there is obviously an element of hallucinating in the dark retreat scenario. She also provides a biochemical explanation. In darkness, the pineal gland in the brain releases a surge of melatonin, the darkness hormone that regulates sleep, which can have sedative effects initially. Some proponents of dark retreats speculate that melatonin may further metabolize into other neuroactive compounds. There are unproven theories that the pineal could produce DMT, a psychedelic, after long periods of darkness, though this is not confirmed science. Regardless, the combination of sensory deprivation, altered neurochemistry, and continuous meditation is enough to produce altered states of consciousness without invoking anything mystical. Research on sensory deprivation, like isolation tank studies, consistently shows people can experience hallucinations, changes in thought patterns, and even paranoia if the deprivation is extreme. In fact, a Wired article notes that some studies found sensory deprivation can induce troubling hallucinations or psychotic-like symptoms in some individuals, emphasizing that it's the brain's normal reaction to lack of input, not necessarily a gateway to an objective spiritual realm. So, does science support any real benefits or truths from dark retreats? There is very little formal research on long-term darkness retreats. The practice is niche and usually spoken of in spiritual contexts rather than studied in labs. Dr. Swart and others report psychological growth, which could be genuine in a subjective sense. For example, similar benefits, reduced fear of death, increased appreciation of life, are reported by people who undergo other intense altered state experiences, like high-dose psychedelic sessions, or indeed NDEs. It's plausible that confronting intense hallucinations or one's own mind in isolation feels like a profound journey, leading to personal insights or shifts in perspective. Early indications from one 2017 analysis suggested some mental health benefits, like reduced stress or improved mood, might result from the practice, but the evidence is far from robust. Essentially, the positive outcomes are anecdotal or self-reported, which doesn't diminish people's individual experiences. But from a scientific view, we can't measure spiritual insight. We can, however, measure risk. Extended solitary darkness could also have adverse effects for some. Anecdotes of people panicking, like the tech CEO who fled after a day due to terrifying hallucinations. As one psychologist noted, we have little understood risks and no systematic studies on negative outcomes, just isolated reports of psychotic-like episodes or prolonged dissociation in some cases. Dr. Swart frames dark retreats as a way for anyone to access the benefits of an NDE without nearly dying. This framing contains an implicit assumption that NDEs confer certain beneficial revelations, less fear, more meaning, because they glimpse more than you can see in day-to-day life. She is careful to concede that, from a neuropharmacology perspective, these are brain-driven altered states, mentioning serotonin 5-HT2A receptors in psychedelics, etc. Yet she quickly adds that experiencing them shows a glimpse into what's possible and can convince you there's more than you can see normally. In other words, even while admitting dark retreat visions are hallucinations, she suggests they might be meaningful or veridical in a spiritual sense. This is a nuanced but important point. Having an altered state experience can feel profound, but attributing it to another dimension or objective reality is a matter of belief, not scientific proof. The interviewer astutely asks, how do we know these experiences aren't just chemicals tricking our senses rather than entry to a different realm? Dr. Swart replies, I think you're right. I think it is just that, scientifically speaking. But once you've experienced it, you might find natural ways to reach such states, and it shows it's possible. This answer is a bit ambiguous. It sounds like she agrees it's internal chemistry, yet she still implies these states point to the mind's greater potential or reality beyond the ordinary. This kind of equivocation blurs the line between a physiological effect and a spiritual truth. It's a form of rhetorical strategy where she maintains scientific credibility, acknowledging the role of serotonin receptors, etc., while still winking at the audience that something deeper is going on. From a credentials perspective, Dr. Swart is on firmer ground here than with afterlife communication. Discussing dark retreat effects is aligned with psychology/neuroscience, altered states research. However, her presentation leans heavily on the mystical interpretation of those states. She cites no peer-reviewed study on dark retreats themselves, likely because few exist. Instead, she draws parallels to known research on meditation and psychedelics. For example, she mentions a paper showing certain breathwork can induce brain effects similar to a moderate dose of psilocybin. Such research does exist. Indeed, hyperventilatory breathwork has been compared to psychedelic trips. Citing that adds scientific validity to the idea that non-drug methods can alter consciousness profoundly. This is true. But again, she uses it to support her broader narrative that by intentionally altering consciousness through darkness, breathing, or psychedelics, we're not just changing brain chemistry, but perhaps peering beyond the veil of reality. This is her interpretation, not a scientific conclusion of those studies. The studies would say X method produces similar neural/psychological effects as Y drug, not this proves an unseen world. Dr. Swart is inserting the latter as subtext. In summary, dark retreats do induce altered states that science can largely explain as sensory deprivation and neurochemical shifts. The visions and insights people have are subjective, potentially valuable to them, but not evidence of external entities or dimensions. Dr. Swart does not claim outright that the visions are real beings. However, by paralleling them with NDEs and saying it convinces you there's more than you normally perceive, she subtly lends them that aura of legitimacy. Scientifically, there is more, but it's more within your brain's capacities, e.g. to generate imagery, to feel transcendent unity, etc. Not necessarily more in the external world. There is no scientific research validating dark retreats as a doorway to objective spiritual communication or metaphysical truth. There is research showing they can affect the psyche, positively for some, negatively for others. Dr. Swart's treatment of the topic again shows how personal and spiritual meaning is mixed with scientific language, a pattern where she describes the biology accurately, melatonin, hallucination, but then uses the outcome, less fear of death, sense of unseen, to bolster a narrative that our consciousness can transcend normal limits. It's inspirational, but it is not backed by hard evidence that those hallucinated lights or beings are anything more than the brain's own creations. Gut health and gut instinct. Fact versus hype. Dr. Swart suggests that improving one's gut health, especially the gut microbiome, can sharpen one's intuition or gut instinct. On the surface, this claim intersects with a legitimate area of research, the gut-brain axis. Modern neuroscience and microbiology have revealed extensive two-way communication between the digestive system and the brain. The gut is sometimes called our second brain because it has its own neural network, the enteric nervous system, and produces many of the same neurotransmitters. Studies have shown that signals from the gut can influence mood, cognition, and even decision-making processes. For example, certain gut bacteria can affect levels of serotonin and dopamine, chemicals involved in mood and reward, and thereby potentially influence how we feel and behave. A recent experiment demonstrated causally that altering the gut microbiome through diet, adding prebiotic and probiotic supplements, made people slightly more prone to reject unfair offers in a social game, essentially affecting their judgment of fair versus unfair behavior. The researchers hypothesized that microbiome changes could modulate brain neurochemistry related to reward and decision-making. This is early evidence that gut bacteria can influence some types of intuitive social decisions, like an instinct for fairness. Given this, Dr. Swart's general point that a healthy gut leads to a clearer mind and better intuition has some scientific plausibility. If intuition is understood as our brain's ability to subconsciously process signals, including bodily signals, and guide decisions, then ensuring those signals are not distorted by inflammation or illness makes sense. Dr. Swart explains that an unhealthy gut, dysbiosis, can cause inflammation, and inflammatory molecules can travel via the bloodstream and even cross into the brain, impairing cognition. Conversely, a balanced gut microbiome produces beneficial molecules and less inflammatory ones, and communicates with the brain through the vagus nerve and other pathways to support normal brain function. This aligns with research. Gut microbes have been linked to conditions like anxiety, neurodevelopmental differences, so balancing them can improve mental health in measurable ways. Dr. Swart mentions that activities like exercise, meditation, and even art can positively influence the gut microbiome. This is a bit less documented, but not far-fetched, as stress reduction via meditation or enjoyable activities can indeed affect gut function and flora indirectly through hormonal changes. Where Dr. Swart drifts from solid science into more speculative territory is in the concept of gut instinct and hidden wisdom in the body. She suggests that if we reduce systemic inflammation and support our gut bacteria, we effectively clear the path for our intuition to flourish. Extra resources become available for higher mental functions like bias-free thinking and intuitive insight. There is some truth here. For example, chronic inflammation and stress can absolutely cloud thinking and increase anxiety, making one more reactive and less able to listen to subtle feelings. Improving gut health could thus indirectly make one calmer and more perceptive. However, Dr. Swart frames it almost as if intuition is a sense organ in the gut that you tune up. She notes the etymology of gut instinct and points out we have neurons in the gut, which is true. The enteric nervous system has millions of neurons. But those gut neurons aren't fortune tellers. They mainly handle digestion and communicate status to the brain. When you feel butterflies or a pit in your stomach about a decision, that's a real physical sensation, often driven by stress responses, which your brain interprets. There's interesting research that people with better interoceptive awareness of internal bodily states like heartbeat or gut feelings, can make advantageous decisions in certain tasks by unconsciously using those signals. For instance, on a gambling task, subtle changes in heart rate or gut sensation can signal risk before the conscious mind catches on, and those attuned to them perform better. So indeed, trusting your gut sometimes means your body is picking up on something real, like a bad food causing nausea or anxiety signaling an unseen danger, and your brain should heed it. Dr. Swart's advice to care for your gut via diet, prebiotics/probiotics, exercise, stress reduction, is standard health guidance now, often recommended for both physical and mental well-being. But she extends it to near spiritual language. talking about hidden wisdom stored in the body and accessing a next level of intuition that's not just cerebral. She lists activities like yoga, drumming, dancing, humming, essentially somatic therapies, as ways to unlock intuition in the body. This echoes certain schools of thought in psychology, e.g., somatic experiencing, or even Carl Jung's ideas of body wisdom. It's not unscientific to say the body holds implicit memories or reactions. For example, trauma can be held in the body as muscle tension and implicit conditioned responses, which is scientific, involving the limbic system, etc. Releasing that via movement or sound can indeed free one from reactive patterns, arguably allowing more clarity. So there is some rational kernel here. By integrating bodily awareness, one might gain insights that the conscious mind alone wouldn't reach. However, calling it 34 senses and one is gut intuition, which is an implication one might draw, would be a stretch. Dr. Swart doesn't literally say that, but she strongly links the expansion of human senses/mind with optimizing things like gut health. It's a holistic approach. If you tune the body and brain, you can tap into intuition and maybe even those signs from beyond. In the transcript, this discussion of gut health comes right after talking about being open to receiving signs and honing intuition through nature and creativity. So the subtext is that improving your gut and bodily state makes you more receptive to subtle cues, perhaps even spiritual ones. Scientifically, we can say improving gut health will likely improve mood, focus, and decision-making, all good things, which could make you feel more intuitively sharp. But any suggestion that it will, for example, allow you to psychically intuit the future or communicate telepathically is not backed by research. Dr. Swart stops short of claiming that explicitly. She sticks to, your intuition will be sharper, which is sufficiently vague. One potential flaw to note is that the gut-brain field is young, and there has been hype. Some popular claims, like 90% of serotonin is in your gut, so gut health fixes depression, are oversimplified. Most gut serotonin doesn't reach the brain. It's used locally for digestion. Dr. Swart doesn't make that particular claim, but in general, the idea of biohacking intuition via probiotics is ahead of the evidence. For instance, studies do show probiotics can modestly affect mood in some cases, but results are mixed. She appropriately warns against mindlessly taking prebiotics and probiotics without understanding underlying issues. This is good scientific caution. She emphasizes reducing inflammation as the key goal, which is indeed a reasonable target for better brain function. So in the balance of this claim, Dr. Swart is mostly aligned with scientific consensus. Take care of diet, stress, sleep, etc. to support your gut, and you will likely think and feel better. The leap is in equating that to sharper intuition in almost a mystical sense. But one could argue even that is reasonable, if by intuition we mean those snap judgments or creative insights that come when the mind-body system is well tuned. Where we must be careful is to distinguish logical fallacies from motivational language here. Dr. Swart might be guilty of a mild false cause implication. If you fix your gut, then therefore your hunches about life will improve. The cause and effect may not be so direct, and other factors, experience, emotional intelligence, play into intuition too. Also, someone with a bad gut, say IBS, isn't necessarily less intuitive as a person. They might just be uncomfortable or anxious. So it's not some magic key to unlock a sixth sense. but rather part of overall mental wellness. Her argument is not fallacious in form, but it is amplified, using scientific credence for gut-brain links to elevate the idea of bodily intuition. It's a pattern we see throughout her talk. Combine a solid scientific fact, bidirectional gut-brain communication, with a broad, enticing concept. Listen to your gut wisdom. It's effective rhetorically because it takes something concrete and uses it to validate a folk notion that people want to believe, that their intuition is real and can be improved. In conclusion, Dr. Swart's claims about gut health and intuition are partially supported by science. A healthy gut contributes to a healthier, clearer mind, which can indeed improve one's emotional intuition and decision-making. She slightly overstates or romanticizes the idea by suggesting stored wisdom and next-level intuition in the body, which strays into metaphor. But compared to her other claims, this one is fairly aligned with current evidence. Just keep in mind, intuition here is being used loosely. Science would phrase it as cognitive emotional benefits. There's no major scientific flaw in saying reduce inflammation, get your body in balance, and you'll be more attuned to subtle cues. Just that we shouldn't interpret it as mystical clairvoyance. It's fundamentally good advice wrapped in a mix of scientific and spiritual language. Patterns in rhetoric and use of science. Throughout the discussion, across all these claims, Dr. Tara Swart exhibits a distinct pattern of combining personal experience, emotional appeal, and scientific language to lend legitimacy to extraordinary assertions. Several key rhetorical strategies and logical fallacies emerge repeatedly. Appeal to authority and self-authority. Dr. Swart frequently reminds the audience of her credentials. I'm a neuroscientist and former psychiatrist, to preface claims that are outside mainstream science. She leverages her past skepticism. I used to section people for saying similar things, to bolster her new claims. If even a hard-headed scientist like me believes this, it must be credible. This is an appeal to her own authority and transformation. She also cites other authorities, doctors having NDEs, professors researching NDEs, to imply corroboration. The fallacy lies in assuming that because an authority figure or expert had an experience or opinion, it is proof of truth. In science, expert testimony is not proof when the matter is still empirical and unverified. Famous example, an astronaut seeing a UFO doesn't prove aliens, despite being an authority in spaceflight. Anecdotes and personal narrative as evidence. The entire conversation is framed by Dr. Swart's moving personal story of loss and signs from her husband. She uses pathos, emotional appeal, effectively. Her grief journey makes the audience empathize and perhaps let down their skeptical guard, because criticizing someone's coping story feels harsh. Once the audience is on her side emotionally, she introduces scientific terms to validate her story. For instance, she recounts the vivid apparition of her husband and then immediately says, "As a scientist, I wanted to back it up with research." The anecdote sets the stage, and then she attempts to upgrade it from anecdote to data by referencing science. But fundamentally, much of what she's found is still anecdotal, cases, personal reports. This pattern can mislead because listeners conflate the emotional truth of her experiences, "I felt my husband's presence," with factual truth. Thus, an afterlife exists. It's a subtle blurring of subjective truth with objective truth. Confirmation bias and one-sided presentation. Dr. Swart openly describes that she, quote, went down a rabbit hole to find science supporting her belief. She did not equally present evidence that contradicts her hypotheses. For example, she never mentions the skeptical research on mediums failing tests, or neurological experiments explaining NDE features. This selective presentation is a form of cherry-picking. It gives the impression that scientific literature is largely in agreement with her, when in fact, it's not. By only sharing the hits, cases, and papers that align with her view, and ignoring the misses, unquote, she constructs a narrative of evidence that is stronger than reality. This exploits the audience's lack of familiarity with the broader research. The audience is unlikely to know what she left out. Argument from ignorance. This fallacy appears when she asserts that because science can't currently explain X, it means X supports her supernatural explanation. For instance, we can't explain how a dementia patient becomes lucid. There is no explanation. Therefore, the mind must be non-material. Just because we don't fully know the mechanism doesn't prove a soul exists. Science's "not explained yet" is not the same as unexplainable by natural means. She effectively uses the mystery as evidence, a classic gap filler argument. The same with near-death veridical perceptions. Because we personally can't imagine how a patient knew the nurse died, she implies it must be actual afterlife contact. This is an appeal to personal incredulity. I, Dr. Swart, can't think of a normal reason, so it must be paranormal. It resonates with listeners. Yeah, how could that be? Must be something beyond. But bypasses careful scrutiny. In truth, alternate explanations, however improbable, can exist, or it can simply be an unresolved question. False dichotomy. Only this explanation. Relatedly, she often presents a phenomenon as if there are only two options: the boring conventional view or her expansive view. Example, either the brain filters a greater mind or what? She implies the only way to account for the shocking abilities is her hypothesis. The reality is there might be multiple natural hypotheses, but those aren't given equal voice. It's a subtle false dichotomy that nudges the audience to accept her side because the only other implied side is nothing interesting is happening, or it's all crazy insane, which she knows the audience doesn't want to choose. She even says people fear talking about these things because they'll be labeled insane, thereby painting skeptics as dismissive and insensitive, and positioning her narrative as the brave, open-minded alternative. Equivocation on terms. Dr. Swart sometimes uses scientific terms in non-scientific ways, blending registers. For example, energy, a physicist's energy, versus a spiritual healer's energy are different. But presenters often use the legitimacy of the physics term to give aura to the vague concept. In the transcript, she largely stuck to concrete terms, but calling intuition a sense or referring to the observable universe analogy for consciousness filtering suggests a mixing of metaphors and scientific concepts. By saying observable universe, a cosmology term, in the same breath as expanded senses, she invokes the notion that just as physics knows there's more universe we can't see, there's more mind we can't see. A poetic comparison, not a proven equivalence. This lends rhetorical weight. It feels scientific because she's referencing known science, dark matter, etc., even though the extension of the analogy to consciousness is speculative. Setting up the skeptic's straw man. Stephen Bartlett plays devil's advocate, but he is a sympathetic interviewer, not a scientist. Dr. Swart gets to field gentle, skeptical questions that she likely prepared for. This can create straw man arguments, where she answers a simplistic version of skepticism, e.g., isn't it just neurochemicals? With a reasonable yes, but that leads back to her point. More robust skeptical counterpoints, like the ones we've analyzed, chance coincidence, cryptomnesia, the power of grief hallucinations, etc., were not brought up in full force. She therefore wins against a diluted skepticism, which makes her position seem stronger. It's a controlled narrative technique in many such podcasts. Address the obvious doubts just enough to assure the open-minded listener, but not in so much detail that the claims crumble. Use of data, quantification to impress. She mentions she did a literature review. She cites over 10,000 recorded NDE cases globally, 34 senses, 50 years of research by someone, etc. These numbers and the phrase literature review give an impression of rigorous scholarship. Yet, the presence of data can be misleading if context isn't given. 10,000 cases recorded. Yes, but recordings of anecdotes, not 10,000 experiments. And 50 years of research. True, researchers like Dr. Bruce Grayson have studied NDEs for decades, but it hasn't yielded a definitive proof of souls. Longevity of research doesn't guarantee validation. Parapsychology has a long history with very mixed results. Nonetheless, quantitative snippets are employed to create a sense that her claims have volume of evidence behind them, even if the nature of that evidence is not examined. It's a persuasion technique. People tend to be swayed by specific numbers and the veneer of research. Personal revelation and humility. An interesting pattern is how she portrays herself as initially skeptical, cautious, even questioning her sanity. This humility, "I even thought, am I psychotic?" serves to preempt criticism. She's signaling, "I know this sounds crazy, I questioned it too." It disarms the viewer from immediately labeling her as credulous. Then her secret is revealed as if it's a big breakthrough. This narrative arc, skeptic to believer because of evidence, is a classic of conversion stories. It's effective because it mirrors what the audience may go through. She essentially invites them to take the same journey, start skeptical, then gradually be convinced by the shocking findings. It's a narrative device rather than a logical argument, but it's powerful in communication. Mixing scientific jargon with spiritual conclusions. Throughout, she uses technical terminology accurately. Working memory, hyperconnectivity, 5-HT2A receptors, vagus nerve, etc. This demonstrates her knowledge and lends credibility. Then she uses more ambiguous or spiritual terms. Psyche, soul, consciousness expansion, signs, beings of light, hidden wisdom. By flowing between the two registers, she keeps the listener's analytical mind and imaginative mind both engaged. This pattern might be called code switching between science and spirituality. Many listeners will remember the science words and think she knows her stuff, and simultaneously feel validated in their hope that science and spirituality are aligning. It's a conscious strategy to build a bridge for laypeople between the material and mystical, a hallmark of many popular science communicators in wellness and self-help spaces. In sum, Dr. Swart's approach showcases the persuasive power of blending storytelling with scientific gloss. She provides just enough scientific fact to anchor her claims. Some true facts: many senses, gut-brain connection, real NDE cases, and then connects dots that science hasn't actually connected. Therefore, mediumship is real. Therefore, mind transcends death. The logical leaps are smoothed over by her earnest personal tone and selective evidence. Logical fallacies like argument from ignorance and confirmation bias are hidden behind earnest statements of conviction and data points that seem to support her. The pattern of combining personal experience, "I felt it," scientific terminology, quantum or neuroplasticity, and broad claims of possibility, "we're capable of so much more," is a well-known formula for selling big ideas that have a kernel of truth but stretch it into speculative territory.
For the critical reader or listener, recognizing these techniques is important. It doesn't mean Dr. Swart is intentionally deceiving. She may truly believe everything she's saying, but it does mean the form of her argument can make unproven ideas sound nearly proven. Separating the actual scientific evidence from the narrative weaving is crucial. In this case, once we tease them apart, we find that our additional senses, our gut-brain axis, and our capacity for altered states are all real and fascinating, yet none necessarily validate communication with the dead or metaphysical realities without further proof. Dr. Swart's podcast performance is a masterclass in how science can be invoked to inspire, to give hope, and to grant a sheen of legitimacy to deeply human spiritual yearnings. It inspires. But from a strictly scientific evaluation, her conclusions go beyond the evidence at hand. Each listener must decide how much weight to give personal conviction versus empirical validation. The signs so far point to intriguing possibilities, not definitive evidence. As scientists often say, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and while Dr. Swart provides extraordinary stories, the extraordinary evidence remains pending.
Ultimately, the conversation encourages an openness to wonder, but we should also maintain a healthy skepticism about leaps in logic. Dr. Swart's style demonstrates both the allure and the caution of mixing science and spirituality. It can illuminate new ways of thinking, but it can also blur the line between what we hope is true and what we can show to be true. The lesson for critical analysis is to celebrate the genuine insights, e.g., caring for our brain and body does enhance our mental capabilities, while carefully challenging the implied leaps. Thus, I spoke to my dead husband. By understanding the rhetorical patterns, we become better equipped to appreciate such discussions without being inadvertently misled.